the sanitary, and it set out a theory of scale drawn from architectural practice in the context of emancipatory struggles. You are welcome to look at his biography in much more detail online, but right now,
thank you.
Please welcome Adrian.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Iftikhar, for the intro, and also Hur and Kudzia for inviting me to this incredible event. I'm going to talk about 3 projects from the Sharjah Architecture Triennial, which is still showing. It closes in just over a week on February the 8th. It opened in November. The theme of the triennial was Rights of Future Generations, and it brought together a series of different kinds of spatial and environmental struggles from across the global south. And the purpose of the exhibition was to try to ask ourselves what it would mean to decolonize the architectural exhibition in the era of climate change. And maybe this is one of the things that we can go into in the discussion panel afterwards. I'm going to speak for about 30 or 40 minutes, and I'm going to start with a project by Nidhi Mahajan, which is called Silences and Spectres of the Indian Ocean. So Cyclone Mukuna devastated the island of Socotra on May 23rd, 2018. Although the cyclone was being monitored closely by meteorologists and dhow sailors, its effects were deathly and unpredictable, sinking 122 fishing boats and over 5 vahans from the Gulf of Kutch. 24 sailors were reported missing. The cyclone then moved toward Salalah in Oman, flooding the streets and sinking even more Kutch vahans. The impact of the cyclone was felt not only in Salalah and Socotra, but across the Indian Ocean in Kutch. And here you can see some clips that we've pulled from YouTube as part of the installation, just showing you the impact of the cyclone. So dhow sailors often circulate videos amongst themselves and their families. Often sailing in pairs, the camera captures life on board, but also at sea. Many of these images of a tempestuous sea, they can toss large container vessels overboard. And the dangers of the sea are documented and shared. Songs that celebrate the protection of God and Sufi saints accompany the images of the dhows at sea. So there's an entire kind of economy of sailors producing these homemade movies on their phones, adding soundtracks to them and sharing them amongst each other, not just over WhatsApp networks, but also over YouTube. So when the men battled the storm out at sea, the women at home rushed to the local Sufi shrines, praying for their partner's safety. The effects of Cyclone Mukuna, the most intense tropical cyclone ever to hit the Arabian Peninsula, rippled out from Yemen and Oman to India. And I'm going to quote just from Nidhi's text, as she's speaking to one of the dhow captains. When the storm abated, Irfan, a dhow captain, and his crew found themselves safe, even as 7 other Indian dhows had sunk in the waters just outside the port of Salalah. They had heard of the destruction that Cyclone Mukuna had caused in Socotra off the coast of Yemen. More than 120 fishing boats and 5 Indian dhows capsized. The cyclone was now heading their way, gathering strength. The cargo remained loaded for safekeeping and to prevent the vessel from capsizing. The dhow was securely moored. All crew members were on board. As the storm approached, the sky churned and the winds roared as high as 185 kilometers per hour. Safely aboard the vessel, Irfan, the captain, took out a small green flag and tied it to a banister near the cabin, chanting along with the entire crew, Yahus. They were calling for the protection of a Sufi saint, Abdul Qadir Gilani, the founder of a Sufi order called Qadariya Tariqa. The flag also called upon another Sufi, Shah Murad Bukhari, now buried in Mundra, West India, not far from the towns of Manvi and Jamsalaya that the sailors called home. The green flag, which you can see here, was cut from a shadar or sheet that had once covered the tomb of Shah Murad Bukhari, a patron saint of seafarers from West India. So the flag carried his blessings. Dhows once harnessed the monsoon winds, this irregular and predictable ecological phenomena enabling movement at sea. These days, weather apps such as windy.com are used to track waves, winds and currents. Yet with climate change, the monsoon and crises are less predictable, interrupted by storms and cyclones. In moments of danger at sea, sailors would call upon Sufi saints to guide them through the stormy weather, the power of an app fading as sailors are confronted with death. Images of the storms are shared between the sailors, the risks of death only mitigated by the miraculous power of the saints. Vahans or mechanized sailing vessels from Kutch traverse the old Indian Ocean shipping routes. The movement of these vahans depends on relationships of patronage, both between sailors and dhow owners, believers and saints. Amidst the smell of diesel, the roar of engines, gusts of winds and waves is an invisible presence. Nidhi writes, "The Vahan moves with the blessings of Sufi saints who once travelled by dhows. These Sufi saints, such as Shah Murad Bukhari, now buried in Mundra, Kutch, Gujarat, India, act as protectors of the Vahans, their cargo and their crew. Images of these saints are plastered in living spaces on board, as well as in the navigation room. Green flags made of cloth that once covered the body of the saint are hoisted on the Vahan each year as an indication of the saint directing the vessel along its safe passage." Shah Murad Bukhari arrived in Mundra, India, from Bukhara around 660 AD by dhow. Upon his arrival in Mundra, its residents, both Hindu and Muslim, were astonished by his miraculous powers. During the reign of Mughal Emperor Akbar, Shah Murad Bukhari was sent to negotiate tax payments from the Rao of Kutch to the Mughals. Even as the Mughal tax collector was sleeping, he had a dream in which his bed was sent out to sea and he was floating in the middle of it. In the dream, Shah Bukhari came to save him. The next day, the tax collector woke up and decided to waive the taxes for the region, indebted to the miracle that Shah Bukhari had performed. Even in the telling of this legend, the sea is alive in many ways, yet it can only be tamed by a saint who arrived on a wooden vessel from elsewhere. So these days, models of Vahans are left at the shrine, as you can see here, as offerings for the saint in return for his protection. In this particular shrine lies a Dayari Bari, or a window to the sea. After the saint's passing, women, men and children travel to the shrine, worried about the safety of those at sea. They would enter the window to the sea, and Shah Bukhari, the saint of the sea, would let them know if their loved ones were safe. The window is now boarded up, the saint silent, as WhatsApp messages carry themselves across the sea. Yet the window, as an architectural feature of the shrine, is a vortex that turns the building to face toward Mecca. For Kutch dhow sailors, according to Nidhi, time and space are felt, lived, and calculated, moved through, and monetized using one unit, the voyage, or as it is known in Kutchi, the gos. A gos indicates a movement from one point to another, linking discrete sites. As dhows voyage from India to the Middle East and East Africa, they connect port cities such as Mundra in India, Dubai and Sharjah in the UAE, Ismailia and Berbera in Somalia, and Mombasa in Kenya. A Vahan is not only a type of dhow used to transport cargoes, it's also a domestic space. And this is why we're interested in it in the context of an architecture triennial, to actually understand the kind of social relationships, the homosocial relationships of men who spend a lot of time together at sea, aboard the vessel, and on the other hand also the women who are left behind while the men are out at sea, often for 5 to 6 months at a time. So it's a domestic vessel for the crew who live on board. The dhow, even as it connects distinct spaces across the seas, is a kind of world unto itself. Ties of kinship, bonds of labour, debt and patronage tie the crew members to each other and to the dhow owners. Dhow sailors who move across the ocean are itinerant, but they make the dhow their home, working in 6-hour shifts across different parts of the vessel. Lonely days at sea are often recorded on camera phone and then sent back to loved ones. So in a region racked by increasingly unpredictable weather, the intercession of saints acts as a kind of insurance, a method of safeguarding against the dangers of the sea. Here, human agency is limited. In a storm or a squall, there is only so much one can do. Yet where the labour of those who live fails, Sufi saints capable of miracles are seen able to intercede for the safety of those on board. And again from Nidhi, The sea is thus alive with spirits. For Kutchi sailors, a Zinda Pir, or living saint, called a Darya Pir, the saint of the sea, reigns supreme. At the beginning of every sailing season, Darya Pir is venerated on land. Sailors carry his flag through their towns, placing it aboard their vessels as they prepare for the next season at sea. It is the green flag of Darya Pir and his constellation of other saints of the sea that guides a gos, or journey, comforting not only those at sea, but also their loved ones at home. Shrines, therefore, of Sufi saints in India become local nodes, spaces in which these saints can be called upon to protect the vessels while they're at sea. A green flag atop the dhow marks the saints' blessings. So this is an image of the installation from the triennial. It's really very simple. It's made up of two architectural models on plinths, a model of the Bukhari shrine and a sectional model of the dhow. Two screens face each other across the space. One plays satellite footage of Cyclone Makuna, while the other plays an edited selection of homemade YouTube clips similar to the ones I showed you earlier. And the project was really an incredible collaboration. One of the things we tried to do in the triennial was to be more interested in stories and certain kinds of conditions and situations, which meant that we were often found ourselves working with people who had no formal practice, who had never exhibited before. So Nidhi's trained as an anthropologist, and this project is a collaboration between an anthropologist, between the sailors, between the manager of the shrine, between the dhow owners and the curatorial team. Nidhi's work is really astonishing. She's a just absolutely brilliant anthropologist, and we wanted to be faithful to that group of people, and so to invent as little as possible. I think this is really important. So during an early conversation, we noticed that there was already a fascinating system of display, which was in fact invented by the sailors. So you could see there are models of dhows which are displayed on top of the shrine. You can see the green boat sitting on top of the shrine, and you can see that there are images of the shrine displayed inside of the dhows. So when trying to work out how to materialize Nidhi's anthropological research, we really just drew on the display system the sailors were already using and decided to make it into an installation strategy. So then on every morning of the 3 days of the opening of the triennial, an object arrived into the exhibition, and the arrival marked the exhibition's relationship to the communities it was working within. So on the first day, a series of these green flags arrived in Sharjah from India by dhow. The sailors on board the dhow were greeted by Emirati musicians playing music used normally to mark the safe return of sailing vessels. So we chose to open the triennial with a symbolic installation of a flag in the show by a marginalized intergenerational community of seafarers to speak to Sharjah's present and historical role within a broader network of African and Asian exchange. The sailors and the musicians formed a procession. They worked their way towards the Old Jubail fruit and vegetable market where Nidhi's project Silencers Inspectors of the Indian Ocean was installed. You can see images of the procession. And as they entered the exhibition, the music began to reach this kind of crescendo of intensity. As a genuine experiment, we gave over the opening of the exhibition to a marginalized group of men and asked them to design an event and to come up with a way of marking the opening. And it's one of those things you have absolutely no idea how it's going to turn out. And so the sailors decided that what they wanted to do is they wanted to install one of these green flags alongside of the model of the dhow in the exhibition to mark the opening. And then what happened was completely unexpected and unplanned. They completely took over the space and broke out into this sweaty frenzy of dancing and drumming, which lasted for about 20 or 30 minutes. So when Nidhi spoke to the sailors afterwards, they said it was one of the most empowering experiences they had had. And something else completely unexpected happened. We've also heard that the sailors now often come to pray at the model of the shrine that was installed. So the installation has become something of a sacred space as well as a cultural one to the community. Okay. The next project I want to talk about is in the Atacama Desert in Chile, and it's called the Atacama Lines. So this is a project about geoglyphs and pathways in the Andes, a combination of large geoglyphs, of large iconographic images that are made by piling rubble in different kinds of ways on the ground in the Atacama Desert over the last 3,500 years. Pathways, which you can see in the next slide, encompass, they're not simple trails in Andean society. In the Aymara world, a taki, or a pathway, it's an entire social universe that encompasses, in a way, every single dimension of life through oral narratives around the past that are recited as people move through the desert. So my colleagues and I had been working in the Atacama Desert for a few years, and we became interested in the way cultural artifacts like the geoglyphs were being used by indigenous groups as a form of resistance to the mining companies who wanted to take over the indigenous land and destroy it in order to secure copper and lithium resources. So this very distinctive concept of the taki places Andean societies really at the opposite philosophical extreme to Western societies, in which history is enclosed in the written word of books and where travel is based on destinations. And this is something that we really thought was incredibly important within the triennial. What does decolonizing an architectural exhibition mean? What does it mean to do an architectural exhibition on the Global South? And the first thing that we thought was important was that to, in a way, expand the concept of what is architecture, to actually say the domestic space on board a dhow where sailors spend 9 months of the year at sea is an important architectural condition. At a global scale, their relationship to the Indian Ocean is an important architectural condition. To try to imagine architecture outside of the concept of shelter, that is to say, outside of the concept of things that look like buildings. Yeah. So, what are the modes of existence? What are the design interventions? What are the ways of modifying landscapes and environments are evidenced throughout the world? Whether they've been described as architecture or not historically was not really important to us. We wanted to understand the way that societies organized their environments in order to organize themselves. And we thought this is a really powerful example of it. So in the Andes, history, the past and the future unfold on pathways, in the itinerary and in the journey as a trajectory. Atacama geoglyphs are commonly found in wide, unproductive desert areas at sites that were used traditionally only by travelers. These areas did not allow for permanent settlement during pre-colonial times, and so we can speculate that geoglyph builders and their publics were travelers themselves. It's also important to remind ourselves that most Andean societies have lost an organic relationship with their past because of the violence of colonialism. Like many other colonized societies, they're reconnecting to their own history through the work of archaeologists. That makes them very different, for example, to Australian Indigenous societies, some of whom came out of the desert and had first contact with white settlers in the 50s and 60s. Yeah, so they're still alive. The European conquest and its militarized evangelism entered the Andes in 1532, impacting and upsetting the entire underpinning of Andean beliefs, transforming them forever. New mnemonic techniques such as writing and the book, especially the Bible, along with European administrative and juridical record-keeping systems, gradually absorbed and eclipsed the memories traditionally kept and narrated in takis through place names, through textiles, through geoglyphs and other kinds of devices. One geoglyph seen in particular in the Quebrada de los Pintados date to colonial times and tell of certain kind of resistance or perhaps insistence through the use of Andean visual mnemotechnics, that is like memory techniques, in the face of a kind of cultural avalanche. So let's take a closer look at some examples. Here you can see just also a set of geoglyphs made up of a very simple pattern that follows the contours of the peaks of these mountains. You start to see the appearance later on of frontal figures, of llamas, and geometric patterns still depicted in an extremely simple form. Later on, more detailed figures emerge. Here you can see two images of llamas next to two Inca, and you can tell from the crosses on their square tunics, next to another figure. And this is the series I was talking about in Quebrada, which is a monumental scene. It's about 70 meters long, and it represents the Spanish arrival into the Atacama Desert during the 16th century. So on one side you can see, like on the would be on your left, you can see a series of llamas, and it's almost you can almost read it as a kind of as a timeline, starting with kind of pre-Columbian figures and ending up with images of conquistadors on the right-hand side, images of the devil and the archangel Saint Michael. I think this is such an extraordinary scene for the way it tries to, in a way, resolve forms of image making that were developing in the Renaissance through this also through the form of the geoglyph. More recently, we can start to see the impact of other kinds of mark making. These are vehicle tracks left by vehicles belonging to the extractive industries, which are really destroying the sites. This is an example from Chuk Chuk. Some of the infrastructure that comes along with the mining industry. And when the geoglyphs are protected, as you can see here, they're often protected with this very, very small fence. And in a way, the line of this fence is the object of struggle, because the mining companies would prefer that each one of these fragments was really just isolated and left by itself, where in fact this entire sendero and the pathway in relationship to the geoglyphs forms a coherent environmental architectural system, and it has to be preserved together, not broken into fragments. And so this is the side of this environmental struggle. These two diagrams are really the two things that really, for me, I thought were astonishing and led to the kind of discussion that ended up being the commission for the triennial. So a sendero is the name given to these particular pathways, and it reappears in the unique Andean representation of their genealogy. Right? So rather than a family tree, as we would use, with a series of branches that would link blood relatives together, the intergenerational relationship in the Andean system appears as a zigzag line. And it appears as a zigzag line because that's the line that you use to move across a mountain. You know, this is how you move through the landscape. And as you move through the landscape, you would encounter certain landmarks, perhaps geoglyphs that have been produced by your ancestors, and you would re-narrate to the people that were part of your caravan your family history. And so this completely alternative model of like a relationship in which, let's say, one's ancestors and the environment are coextensive. They're in continuity with each other. For us, in this, as a kind of both a kind of epistemological and a philosophical way of thinking about how human beings relate to their environment, intergenerationally became really, really important. And I also want to draw your attention to the image on the right-hand side. And you can see this forlorn figure standing under the arch, who's there like alone. So what's really fascinating is a complete inversion of how we understand architecture. Yeah. So in a Western metaphysics, the architecture is the thing that protects you from the environment. But in order for architecture to shelter you from something, to protect you from something, that thing needs to be a threat to you. That is to say, first you need to see yourself as separate to the environment. Here, the social relationship and the environment are in continuity. The person that is isolated is the person that tries to shelter themselves up from that world, that is unable to move through it. Here you can see maps showing the extent of these caravan networks in the Andes. And this clip will take you through some of the geoglyphs at Chuk Chuk in a little bit more detail. Chuk Chuk is one of the highest concentration of geoglyphs in the entire Andes. Yeah. I'm going to skip it. We're going to just put down home. The claim the triennial makes is that if we're going to decolonize the exhibition, we have to understand this as a form of architecture. What are they fighting against? So members of the Hortakondo community, the community that we were working with in Chukchuk, working alongside architects and environmental lawyers, have been using the cultural classification of the geoglyphs as a means to retake possession of their land and prevent its destruction by mining interests. Here you can see the largest open cut copper mine in the world and its tailing ponds in Chuquicamata. And we want to use the platform of the exhibition, as with almost all of the projects, as a way of bringing attention to these people's struggle. So we hosted a press conference on the morning of the second day of the program, where Mauricio Hidalgo, leader of the Hortakondo community, announced that had lent the mountains to the triennial for the period of the exhibition for 3 months, explained the plight of his communities as he struggled against the mining giants. This is the first room of the installation, which you can see some of the aerial images that you've seen this afternoon, located on these around the edges of the room, and the sendero in plan on a light box in the middle of the room. In the second part of the room, we had a series of lines drawn at different scales, from the genealogical diagram of the intergenerational relationship in Andean society, all the way to a kind of territorial map of caravan routes through Latin America. And one of the other things that we did, which is one of the most probably maybe one of my highlights of the entire event, was bring a group of 16 artists and their descendants from a remote community in Western Australia, who worked on one of the other projects in the triennial, the Nugura Canvas, which is another story entirely, but had similarly used a cultural artifact in a victorious struggle for native title in Australia, winning back 86,000 square kilometres. And to bring them together with this Andean community as bringing together two desert communities, one from Chile, one from Australia, both in struggles against mining companies, both deploying artistic expression, one from the past, one from the present, as a way of claiming back their autonomy and empowering themselves. And so we had this just series of fantastic discussions where the various artists presented their work to each other and talked about their various experiences. It was just an astonishing moment. I think one of the things I tried to do with the triennial, I mean, I've never curated anything in my life and probably won't again, was to try to see how you use the vehicle of an exhibition to do political work in the world. Yeah, I think that was the most important thing. And actually establishing these kinds of conversations, using these conversations to set up projects that empower these people, but also understand that there are shared struggles and shared demands, even if they're separated by the Pacific Ocean, that they have something in common and that they can learn from each other. And in that respect, the installation itself is a kind of pretext to set those things into motion. Yeah. So the exhibition lasts for 3 months. You know, there's a book that comes out, it's really wonderful. But it's actually, what is the legacy, what is the social political legacy of the exhibition for the people that were generous enough to work with us and participate in the project? I think for me this is always the key question. I'll show you one more project. So this is actually one of the first projects that I commissioned. It was the first project that I commissioned. It's by an architect, I'm sure you know her, Marina Tabassum, who's between Harvard GSD and Bangladesh. And it's called Inheriting Wetness. And it really looks at the condition of the Bengal Delta. And the way it was commissioned, I was in the back of a taxi on my way to Sharjah, I think, with Marina. And she told me this incredible story, which I couldn't quite believe. She said that she had heard that there was a part of the Bengal Delta where grandparents would point to the middle of the river, and they would tell their grandchildren that's where we used to live, and when the river moves, that's the plot of land that either you or your children should go and reclaim. So it's kind of oral history, but an intergenerational land title passed on through oral history. What's really interesting about it for me was that the Bengal Delta is one of the most dynamic conditions in the world. Really, as you can see in these maps, completely confounding any neat distinction we can make between dry and wet, between solid and liquid. Yeah, and I thought, what an excellent way of thinking about some of the ambitions of the triennial, which is to try to imagine what kinds of strategies we can use as the climate becomes increasingly unpredictable, as our environments start to behave in ways that we don't anticipate, to look at this beautiful process of intergenerational adaptation through an extremely modest architectural form in this context of Bangladesh. So here you can see a satellite image of the wetlands at the bottom of the delta. And just to give you a sense of how the delta changes over time, these are some satellite images in which you can see the appearance of these chars, which are these little islands which come up out of the delta and expand, eventually becoming solid land. And so the edge condition is continually moving. Yeah. So what's liquid and what's dry are in a process of endless exchange with each other. So how does settlement respond to this highly dynamic condition? You can see some more images. Well, one way that settlement responds is through through the collapse of buildings and riverbank erosion. That's one version of how architecture responds to that kind of edge condition. Another way that architecture, or through like reinforcement through the use of sandbags, as you can see here. Another way that architecture responds is through production of a series of very, very modest demountable dwellings that are continually disassembled and reassembled to follow the line of the shore as it moves. Here you can see some of the land titles that are used to negotiate these intergenerational property relationships. This is one of the surveys that are used during these negotiation processes, which can be quite complex, as you can imagine, because it's very difficult to establish reference points as the landscape's continually moving. So we spoke to Marina, and we were trying to work out what to do around the installation, how to really best convey this extraordinary condition, this extraordinary environmental condition and the vernacular response to it. These are the dwellings themselves. You can see that if you took away the ornamentation from the top, they could almost be Japanese in their simplicity. They have an extremely simple plan. They're highly porous. They come in different module sizes. This is a one-story version. They also come in a two-story version, which you'll see. And Marina suggested that she wanted to bring 3 of them and build them in the triennial. So I thought, okay. So with a team of a group of people who are expert in building these structures, they arrived, and in a week and a half, they had built three of these dwellings. The really fascinating thing about these dwellings is over the course of their lifespan, they might move 6 or 7 times. So it's almost like, furniture that you would take with you. They flat pack and they ship really easily. And then inside of the 3 dwellings, Marina had a series of presentations which took the audience through the various forms of research that she had done with her team at Marina Tabassum Architects, looking at this condition from various kinds of perspectives, from a physicochemical perspective, understanding the materiality and the structure of this kind of hybrid solid liquid condition, through the various forms of like legal and political negotiation, also through the land grabbing that takes place, and also through a series of really, really beautiful interviews that she conducts with people, with the various families, trying to better understand their experience as they carve out spaces of viability in this very, very complex environment. I'm going to leave it there. So thank you very much, and I'm going to join Rafi for some questions and a discussion afterwards.